Inc. is the Business Improvement District organization for downtown York. And our mission is to drive investment in downtown York through economic development, placemaking, public safety, and events and promotion. And the topic that we want to talk to you about today is regarding public safety, and is very timely for all of us. Our topic today is de-escalating conflict in uncertain times, and we do have speakers who are going to present some information that we think will be very useful to all of you. And so we thank you for joining us and giving us time to share this with you this morning. Just a little bit about the business series. If you've joined us before, you know we host this business series usually in person at the Center for Community Engagement, but now virtually, and we thank PNC again for making it possible for us to continue this series virtually. Each month, third Wednesday of the month, you can see the schedule at the website downtownyorkpa.com. We started the year with a full slate of topics, and then COVID happened and our priorities changed. And so we have tried to be nimble and adapt the topics and the conversations that we have here with you to be relevant to the information that you need at this time. And so it's the reason that we're having this conversation about de-escalating conflict. And what we would just ask is, if there's anything else that you would like to hear about that's on your mind for upcoming business series, there's a chat box here on the bottom of the screen. If you would just enter, topics that you'd like to hear about in upcoming series, that would be fantastic. We'd love to hear from you and know what's on your mind. Also, just a couple housekeeping things for today's presentation. Because there are so many people on the call, we won't be able to do verbal Q&A. However, we'd love to take your questions, so you'll see also a box that says Q&A. You can click on that and enter your questions, and at the end of the presentation, we'll allow at least 10 minutes to talk about what's on your mind and questions, and have some dialogue that way. Everyone's microphone is muted, and that just makes it easier for us to keep the program moving along without interruption. If you are having trouble hearing on the virtual call, you can dial in through one of the phone numbers that was provided when you received your confirmation of your registration for the event. So before I introduce today's speakers, I just wanted to share with you conversations that I've had over the months, just talking with merchants about different situations that might arise in your store, in your organization. I think we've all been in situations where maybe we've been in a retail location and we saw an interaction maybe with an employee and a customer, or something that happened. Maybe you were involved with it, and maybe you thought to yourself, wow, that employee really handled that situation well. But there've also been times where maybe you observed something or you were involved and you thought, well, that probably could have been handled a little bit better. And now in this age of social media, where everybody's recording everything on their cell phones, we're seeing a lot of it on the news. We've all seen situations recently in the media where situations certainly could have been handled differently. And so we have experts in public safety here today to help us to navigate these situations and to be prepared to handle them better and for the benefit of our entire community and public safety. So joining us this morning, we have George Giangi. He's with the South Central Task Force. George has over 30 years of experience in the field of emergency management. He provides consultation on business continuity planning, security, counterterrorism, critical infrastructure protection, workplace violence intervention, and so much more. So we asked George to come and present first, and he'll be followed by Sergeant Kaler, who is a 20-year veteran of the York City Police Department. And I just want to say, Sergeant Kaler, we are very thankful to you at Downtown Inc. for your partnership over the years, for working with us for the enhancement of public safety in our city. Sergeant Kaler oversees the department that includes the downtown officer, who's responsible for all the calls in the business district and larger events in the area. So we thank you for joining us and offering us an expert perspective. And with that, I will turn it over to George DeAngie. Thank you, George.
Can you all hear me okay? Very good. Thank you for that introduction, Elaine. So yeah, I was asked to kind of give a presentation on the three topics of interest: workplace violence, awareness, recognition, how to diffuse some of these interactions before they eventually get into a hostile or violent mode, what to do in the event of an armed assailant or an armed intruder, and then finally, what's on everyone's mind is civil unrest. How do we deal with that issue as well? So looking at the spectrum of workplace violence, at the very far left are behaviors of concern, which we really are going to spend most of the time on in the first part of the presentation. And it gets into threatening behaviors, physical injury, and then finally death. It may not necessarily be a linear progression. There's no doubt that if you can cut this spectrum somewhere in the beginning, recognition of the behaviors of concern that necessitates some level of intervention, that's really where we can most be effective. And again, looking at this, there may not necessarily be a specific profile of workplace violence offender. It could be fairly spontaneous. We've all been on edge these first 5 months in 2020. What between the coronavirus and the closure of the economy, basically, people are on edge. Tempers are, tend to be a little bit high, and of course, certainly now with protestings and the civil unrest, people have been a little difficult at best to deal with the situation, rightfully so. So behaviors or concerns are issues or behaviors that make someone feel uncomfortable. It's the best way to kind of describe it. If you see something that just doesn't look right, doesn't sound right, you overhear a conversation suggesting something about, I'm going to get even with them, or they're going to pay for this, that sort of thing. It may be, they're just venting. It may be that they're just at their wits' end. But if left unaddressed, it could potentially escalate to a violent, toxic work environment. And by the way, when I'll talk about some of these, it may be worker, coworker, it may be worker, customer, it could be a supervisor to employee type of interactions. So these are some areas to consider. Maybe someone has a frequent aggressive outburst. They're just never happy with their job, constantly complaining about certain things. They have a history of violence or threats. Maybe they show an over obsession with weapons or the violent contents that may be going out in today's world. These are just again at the early onset, enough to kind of let you feel that something's just not right about X, Y, and Z. Let me do something about it. Let me let someone know. In some cases, it may be just as simple as talking with that person, and maybe they just need some shoulder to sort of cry on or vent. But again, if you don't do anything at all, it may not necessarily go away. There may be verbal abuse of coworkers, customers, harassing phone calls or emails, someone that holds grudges. We're going to get into another slide further down, but just remember the term injustice collectors. Someone that holds a grudge, they're unable to handle criticism. In some cases, they may feel like you've been putting them down in front of their coworkers, or maybe a customer feels like they've been demeaned They haven't been dealt with respectfully. And again, most people, most healthy people just shirk that off as, yeah, okay, it was just a bad day. Let me just forget about it. Where others tend to dwell and become hypersensitive about it and carry that feeling, carry that sentiment. In some cases, weeks, months, or even later, and fully intending to come back and settle the score. They're going to make it right, type of thing. And it manifests itself in various forms. Sadness, for example, may not necessarily sound like something that may result in violence, but in fact, if a person can't handle the situation, the card that they've been dealt with, if you will, it may manifest itself in some form of hostility. In some cases, it may even result in suicide. And again, don't focus on just one snapshot. I like to use the example of, maybe somebody had a wedding over the weekend and had a little bit too much to drink, not much sleep, and they come in Monday just a little disheveled. That's not what we're talking about. We're really talking about someone who's always had a history of being punctual and rather well kept, and all of a sudden you start to see a deterioration in their performance or their behavior. Learn to recognize some of those signals, and maybe all that's necessary is to just give a heads up to the supervisor or to an HR person or to someone that says, maybe it's just me, but I've sort of sensed a little bit of deterioration in the way John or Ralph or Mary have been acting lately, and it may not be anything, but I just want someone to know about it. And it may very well provide that needed counseling or assistance that person needs to get over that hardship or challenge that he or she may be experiencing. So again, maybe some minor nonviolent conflicts that go unresolved could end up being part of that violent spectrum, eventually getting into threatening behavior, physical injury, or death. I once did an assessment for a medical facility where they had an unusually high number of workplace violence incidents over the course of a few months. And when I went and looked at some of the incident reports, one, for example, included it was a number of people that were in a waiting room waiting for their appointments, and they were about an hour and 15 minutes running behind schedule. It turned out the physician was called to the hospital for an emergency, but it just coincidentally happened to be that they were celebrating another physician's birthday. And coincidentally, the celebration of the birthday happened to be adjacent to the patient waiting room. So imagine you're sitting there an hour and 15 minutes late for your appointment, and you see people walking out of this birthday room with cake and coffee and joking and laughing, and you're sitting there, you're stewing because you're an hour, 15 minutes late. Of course, your thought is, as a patient, the reason you're late is because everybody's having a party, which was obviously not the case. A person got so upset, went up to the receptionist and started yelling about, why am I an hour, 15 minutes late? Is my time any less important than the physician's time? And he got so volatile, so upset, grabbed the stapler and actually just threw it against the wall. Fortunately, didn't hit anybody, but you could see that the situation, the circumstances led to that act of hostility, that act of violence, where it could have been, like Elaine mentioned earlier, could have been dealt a little bit better, a little bit more sensitive in terms of letting the people know, hey, we're sorry, we're running a little late through no fault of our own. The doctor was called to the hospital for an emergency call, that sort of thing. I think most people would understand. And would you like to reschedule your appointment, or would you like to wait it out? So again, those kinds of interventions, I think, could have stopped that from evolving into the hostile act that it did end up as. So domestic violence is another area that is of a lot of concern. Unfortunately, the statistic at the bottom of the slide, 1 out of 4 women in today's workplace is somewhat affected by domestic violence. It could be a spouse, it could be a significant other, or it could be worker on coworker. But the pattern of behavior suggests that it results in physical violence, in intimidation, in threats. It may manifest itself in employees receiving a number of phone calls where there may be a higher than normal level of decibels, if you will. Maybe a female employee showing up for work. It's 90 degrees out, like we've been experiencing, this week or about to experience this weekend, and they're wearing a turtleneck sweater type of thing, or coming in with sunglasses on to kind of hide some of their injuries. All these suggest potentially some early warning indicators that domestic violence may be in play. If there is a domestic violence act and the employee informs supervision or human resources, and they file an order of protection or a protection from abuse type of an order, we recommend that employees should notify their supervision, if they can even provide a photo of who that person is, so that the receptionist at least is leaning forward and is aware that while Mary's spouse normally comes in around lunchtime to visit with his wife, now that there's a PFA filed, I'm not going to let him in as easily as I would have normally. So again, that kind of information is important to alert your company about. Oops. So again, for a PFA protective measures you might consider as a business, certainly encourage employees to notify the supervision if they do file a PFA. Also include on the PFA not only your home address, but your work address, recognizing that if someone wanted to plan an attack on someone, there was no easier way to plan an attack than the workplace. When they start working, when they leave work, what car they drive. Being creatures of habit, they probably know where you park the vehicle. So you might want to take those into considerations. We mentioned providing a photo to the receptionist or the security. You might want to stagger work times, vary where you park your vehicle, maybe even consider walking out with another employee or a security person if you have them, or even panic alarms. They also have a lot of wireless panic alarms that you may want to assign an individual during these challenging times. So what might trigger some event to result in hostility? It could be something like a reprimand, termination, layoff. Could be a financial situation. It could be a custody battle. Maybe you've been diagnosed or somebody's been diagnosed with some terminal illness. And again, the healthy person looks at some of these challenges and says, I'm going to suck it up. I'm going to get through this. I'm going to be fine type of thing. Whereas the unhealthy person says, why me? This isn't right. This isn't fair. Again, getting to that same phrase we mentioned earlier, I'm an injustice collector. I will never forget or forgive the wrong that's come my way, and somebody's going to pay for this. Again, it's not right, but it's hard to rationalize irrational thinking. And this is kind of a nice segue into the last topic of civil unrest, but we'll kind of save that for that time period. So some of the reporting options, for some, as I mentioned, a lower level type of behavior, you might want to just give that person some of your time. Give them your ears. Let them vent, and maybe that's all he or she needs to get over that hardship. In other cases, you might want to bring in HR or supervision, maybe get another coworker who says, I've experienced the same thing. It's not just John that's seeing an erosion in Ralph's behavior, but I've seen a number of issues, and I just kind of set them aside. But now it seems like they've been more and more coming. Maybe if you don't have something already, have something like an anonymous tip line or a suggestion box where someone doesn't have to fear retribution and still is able to inform someone about someone's behavior. So again, these are important to consider. Dealing with angry behavior, you might want to, in some cases, ask the uninvolved parties and the anger-directed parties to leave the area if it can be done safely. So imagine a customer is really acting out, and he just isn't connecting with one of your employees. The chemistry isn't there. For whatever reason, it's hard to rationalize, but for whatever reason, he is just not working with that one customer or that one employee. You might want to ask that employee to step away, and a new face comes in, and now the customer feels like, I've got a new start. Let me start from scratch. You don't want to stand any closer than 4 feet. It's essentially just trying to get away from an arm's length in case it does resort to hostility or violence. You might want to have a prearranged code word, and it should be a word that isn't normally part of your vocabulary in the line of business that you work with, just to inform a coworker subtly, discreetly, things aren't right here. Maybe you should call the police or call, a coworker to come in. I'm seeing this thing going south. I don't like where this is heading. You don't want to ever challenge or try to bargain with someone that's really irate or that's really hostile. Maybe describe the consequences. Look, let's try and work this out. Let's be civil about this. We really don't want this to escalate where we call in the police and it gets to be kind of an unruly type of a thing. Let's try and work something out. What do you think went wrong, and what can we do to make it go away type of thing. And certainly you don't ever want to physically touch an outraged person or try to force them to leave. Don't resort to any physical altercation. That's really outside of your wheelhouse, if you will. Workplace parking. I mentioned earlier that if someone files a PFA against someone, workplace parking, if it's a parking lot or a garage, is certainly a vulnerable plan of an attack. So you might want to consider that, walking out with a coworker, as we mentioned, maybe having your keys in hand. Just be observant. Be observant of the surrounding area. Ask for an escort if you feel it's necessary. And just look around. Be vigilant, if you will, before you get into the car. And employee terminations. You might want to collaborate with security or supervision to evaluate the potential for violence. We've seen a number of these termination proceedings end up being a hostile event. Let's face it, the employee probably knows if he's called in to talk to HR at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, it's not going to be because he's considered for a vice presidency opening. He probably knows already his performance hasn't been good. He's been on probation and that sort of thing. So he may go into this termination proceeding fully intending to be fired. And maybe, God forbid, he comes in with a loaded pistol, anticipating he being fired. And again, it's not fair. So I'm going to get back to them type of thing. You certainly don't want them to come in with a bag or a lunch pail or anything that may be carrying a weapon into a proceeding like that. Let's face it, you are setting up the process, so configure the room with safety in mind. So for example, you don't want to have furniture or that employee that's being fired stand between you and the exit door. You want to ensure that access devices are disabled, so he can no longer, he shouldn't have hard keys, key cards, IT access should be disabled. All of that should be taken into account because, again, the employee termination is a pretty contentious type of an issue that could result in violence. Some organizations have actually put together a threat assessment team. So let's say you get a bomb threat on a phone call, or let's say there's a threat of protests or civil unrest in your area. People from various departments get their heads together and just say, okay, so is this something that is worth us taking some action? Is this threat, do they have the intent and capability to carry out this threat? Or is it just, somebody wanting to disrupt our business? So you want to gauge that potential for violence. Determine if and when law enforcement should be brought in. Should we place a call to Sergeant Kaler and just let them know, hey, we received this threat. Is there anything that we should be doing other than what we've done already? Should we evacuate the store type of thing? And again, that's something to work out with your own folks in terms of where you go with a known threat that surfaces to your business. So the important takeaway for the next part is the active shooter or the armed assailant. We're going to get into if you ever run across, and it's unlikely that you're going to, but if you ever run across an armed assailant, whether it be at the workplace, at the movie theater, at the mall, it really doesn't matter. What you're going to get out of the next few slides is life-saving material or information for you to know. Most armed assailant incidents end on average 5 to 6 or 7 minutes. The strategy is so important for you to buy time and get out of harm's way until the emergency response team show up, the quick response team, their SWAT team, whatever they happen to be called in your area. And if you think it sounds like gunshots that you just heard, act as if it is. That's important. These 3 bullets, if you can kind of remember those 3 bullets in an armed assailant or an armed intruder, it's going to be extremely important. Okay, so the first thing you want to do for an armed intruder, an armed assailant, is you want to run. If you can evacuate safely, do so. Look at your surroundings no matter where you are. So you're going into a bonefish restaurant. Where is the nearest exit? Am I seeing everybody that's coming in? I like to use the example when I talk to police officers. Some police officers, it's ingrained in their training. It drives their wives nuts in most cases. A male police officer goes into the restaurant and they kind of looking for the best table for them to sit at. And when you ask what that best table is, or the premier table, it's one where they can see everybody coming into the restaurant, and there's a door behind them, an exit behind them that's locked from the outside, but they're able to open it from the inside and escape. That's ideal. They're thinking ahead. They're leaning forward. In the event that someone comes in with a gun, they know their escape route. They've seen them. They have time to react. So obviously, you have to kind of strike a balance between paranoid and good proper planning. But have an escape route in mind. Escape or evacuate regardless of whether others agree to do so or not. Leave the belongings behind and help others only if it's safe for you to do so. Prevent individuals from entering the area. They may not know there's an active shooter going on. Move in the direction the police are coming in. Keep your hands visible to police. Follow their instructions. Again, don't attempt to help or move wounded people. The police have the proper protocol, and only when it's safe to do so, call 911. So there's a vulnerable population that I like to define as children or mentally or physically impaired individuals. In the case of vulnerable population, it may not be practical to evacuate them, certainly as a group. Autistic kids, for example, or people that may be part of a dementia unit at a retirement community, running is not really practical. So you might want to look at other options to consider for vulnerable population, maybe providing for additional barriers, making it a little harder for someone with a weapon to access the dementia unit, for example, of a retirement community. They have to bust down 2 or 3 doors to get to them. And remember I said that these incidents last 5 to 7 minutes. In most cases, the person with a weapon knows that their time on earth is limited. They're going to do as much maximum damage as they can in those 5, 6, 7, or 8 minutes because they know they're either going to kill themselves, or the police are going to kill them, or they're going to be arrested. So they want to maximize the kill, if you will. So if you make it harder for them to access certain areas, a room with a door that's locked versus a room with a door that's unlocked, they're going to go to the path of least resistance. You might want to also consider just-in-time locking mechanisms that normally is not used, but in the event of a security incident or an armed intruder incident, they can implement those kinds of locking mechanisms. Night lock is a commercially available lock that falls into that category. Maybe dedicating a nearby safe room where you can gather some of the vulnerable population into that area just to get out of harm's way until the police arrives. So hiding, if evacuating is not practical, look for a hiding place that provides you out of the view of the active shooter. It provides for protection if shots are fired. And that's what we call cover and concealment. Very simply, concealment may be hiding behind a curtain where he doesn't know that somebody's behind the curtain. However, if he fires his pistol or his rifle, the curtain isn't going to do anything to stop the bullet from penetrating. So that option of hiding behind a curtain versus hiding behind a metal filing cabinet, certainly the metal filing cabinet provides you concealment and it provides you some protection from a bullet. So that's cover and concealment. And ideally, your hiding place may allow you a secondary or tertiary means of escape. You should have a room that can be locked from the inside, and any glass areas should be able to be protected with a shade or a blind, Venetian blind, for example, just to ensure that that person does not know there's 5 or 6 people hiding out in this room. I'm going to bypass this room because it doesn't look like it's being occupied. So once you get into this hiding place, lock and barricade the door, turn off the lights, silence anything that makes noise, your phone, your pager, radio, television, copier, whatever. Spread out, hide behind large items, and remain quiet. And only as a last resort would we encourage you to make a plan of an attack. So if this person with a gun finds his way into the hiding place that you're in, maybe you might want to have 1 or 2 of the biggest guys on either side of the door. Look to see what can you use as an improvised weapon. Maybe you have a fire extinguisher in there. Discharging a fire extinguisher is a pretty effective deterrent against someone coming after you. Throwing chairs, in some cases when we've done some of these exercises, just throwing a jacket over somebody's head disorients them. He doesn't know where you are, and you can overpower that individual. Maybe there's 10 of you and only 1 of him. You can kind of overpower him until the police arrives. So getting into the last topic of civil unrest, I'm just going to hit on some of the salient points, and more importantly, what to do and what not to do in this case. Unfortunately, the country has experienced a number of these in the last week or two. In some cases, such as Seattle, for example, they've actually occupied, I think it's like 6 city blocks now. So who are they? In most cases, outraged citizens peacefully protesting an issue. I don't consider that civil unrest, and for purposes of this presentation, would not be even considered. Everyone has a right, a First Amendment right, to have freedom of speech, to exercise that right. The majority of protests don't ever involve civil unrest. However, other components may join the protesters, including anarchists, intending to disrupt society and making their goals or their mission in life known to the world, because they know that the cameras are on the protesters. So what better way to kind of get into the limelight, if you will, than to be part of that group. And the third group is looters or criminals, which are really just nothing more but people taking advantage of the chaos, the opportunity to go in and get some property with less likelihood of them ever being caught. So anarchists, again, hijacking a legitimate protest, makes it harder for the elected officials and law enforcement to use force, even if they riot and loot. The optics just makes it difficult for elected officials and again, and law enforcement to take action. Elaine mentioned earlier in the introduction, everybody carrying a cell phone now with a camera can record a video, and how would that be seen if it ever got out that, you know, this was overpowering people that are just merely exercising their First Amendment rights. So in most cases, anarchists typically oppose capitalism, oppose democracy, oppose government. They resort to violence. They condone violence. In most cases, they believe that their cause is not being advanced by merely protesting, but the only way to get people's attention is to burn and riot and hurt somebody, and that's their way of advancing some of their causes. They may incite protesters to join in some of that destruction, unfortunately. And we mentioned the first 5 months of 2020 being the way it is. What between the coronavirus, the shutdown of the economy, people not working, not being able to go through any sporting events, not being able to shop, not being able to go to restaurants. They're cooped up in homes. Some of them may be maybe a little antsy and see this as an opportunity to kind of get their vent their dissatisfaction with what's going on. So looters, as we mentioned, is just, again, opportunistic. They want to take advantage of the chaos, break into businesses and loot, get as much as they can, especially wearing masks and being part of this group. This lesser likelihood for them to ever get caught. So the probability of occurrence for civil unrest, it increases with contentious issues. So increases in racial, political tensions, and the proximity of some of these high target facilities. I put in 3 or 4 examples. Government building, if you're a business that happens to be close by to a government building, to iconic statues or landmarks, to the downtown district, to the sporting complexes, that may have a higher level of occurrence of civil unrest than if you're out in a more rural type of a setting. So my recommendation is to maintain situational awareness. Lean forward, keep your finger on the pulse, if you will. Are there any contentious issues, potential protests? Have permits been filed? Maybe have somebody monitor the news and social media, one of your staff members. Look for signs and graffiti of anarchists. I think we've all seen what some of the symbolisms include. You know, that indicate a certain cult or certain group as far as you know, what graffiti they would spray on a wall. Contact police for advice. I know Sergeant Kaler is going to be discussing at the end of the presentation what York City Police is doing in these kinds of events. They are very much you know, available for you in terms of, hey, is this something for my business to be concerned about? Gauge the potential for violence. This group that's filed to file a protest or filed a permit for a protest, what have they done in the past? What's happened in other nearby areas to my business? Go to school on some of that information. Maybe you might want to coordinate with neighboring businesses, just like you have your group right here. There's one website that I like to use as an example, nextdoor.com, and I'm sure there's a number of others similar to that, where like-kind organizations, it could be a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, or it could be a number of businesses in the York downtown area. But on that website, you post things that are timely and relevant for other excuse me, businesses to know about, just keeping them informed. So developing a civil unrest plan. First and foremost, consider the safety of workers and customers. You know, assigning a safe area, secondary means of escape. You can always recover property and inventory, but you can't recover lives. So include in your plan a communication scheme. How am I going to notify and communicate with my employees? Personnel accountability, including customers as well as employees. Consider protective measures if you remain open. So, for example, have your workers report to work in casual clothes and not in business identified clothing so that they're less likely to be involved or interface with the protesters. Employees should not engage with protesters on any level if they can avoid it. Develop trigger points as to when you want to close the business. At what point do we close that it's safer to close than to open? And time permitting, try to safeguard valuables, lock all doors, board up the exterior, look at your CCTV coverage. Ensure all exits have quick release features in the event that people have to escape. And this is just an example of what some businesses have done. Insurance coverage. Excuse me. Check with your agent on adequacy of coverage. In some cases, unfortunately, you have to ask the right questions in order to make sure that you're properly covered. So the limits, the terms, exclusions, business interruption insurance, civil unrest. Insurance policies might specifically say we'll only cover you if you experience property damage. However, what if there's no property damage to your business, but because of the rioting and the looting, you're unable to access your business because they've cordoned off that area? Does insurance cover you for those kinds of things? You have to ask all these questions to really get a good sense as to whether you have a good coverage on your policy or not. If it's ruled an act of terrorism, is that specifically covered? In some cases, you have to opt in or opt out for act of terrorism. Most times people will try to save on the premium and think, you know, what are the odds of somebody, a terrorist attacking my little business who sells sporting goods? On the other hand, you know, we've seen what just happened. So, you know, maybe you might want to reconsider that. Typically, that doesn't increase much in the form of premiums, where it's peace of mind to know that if you do experience it, it's covered. And we recommend you videotape the interior, including your inventory and the exterior of the business before any civil unrest, and just have that documentation available for you to provide to the insurance company. So in summary, I kind of want to emphasize three major bullets. Be aware of the behaviors of concerns. They're most likely not going to go away, and they could escalate to an act of violence. In an armed assailant event, remember the three terms of run, hide, or fight. And for civil unrest, stay situationally aware, safeguard your workers and customers, time permitting, try to protect your property, and also make real sure that you've got insurance coverage that's adequate to protect your business interruptions, and that sort of thing. And that concludes my presentation. And I know at the end of of Sergeant Kaler's presentation, we're going to entertain any questions. This is my email address. If someone would like to get onto my email distribution, I'd be happy to provide you with situational awareness updates that you might find helpful in your day-to-day business life. Elaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, George. That was really great information, insightful and practical guidance that I know will be valuable to our business owners in downtown, and certainly information that I know I can use for our organization going forward. So I thank you for that. And now I'd like to turn it over to Sergeant Kaler with the York City Police Department for some brief remarks. Sergeant Kaler, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, George. My part of this presentation, I was asked to put sort of a local spin on the topics that he discussed. And I do have some things to add. And this first issue is something that kind of relates to all of it. It kind of spins off the active shooter part and as well as the civil unrest thing. But one thing to keep in mind when you do need to call 911 is if you can, please use a landline. And the reason I ask that is if you can't talk with the situation that's developing in front of you, if you're on a landline as opposed to a cell phone, it is far easier for us to figure out where you are. We can triangulate a cell phone, but it does take some time and it leaves us within about 15 feet away. But as he discussed, some of these incidents, they take place very quickly. 5 to 7 minutes is an average response time for when we're not heavy on call volume. So if you can use a landline, you're getting us there that much quicker. And that relates to, like I said, all of the things we discussed this morning, be it the domestic violence and anything, anytime you would have to use it. If you do use your cell phone, if you can't talk, that's okay. Leave it out so the dispatcher can listen to what's going on. That information then gets relayed to the rest of the dispatcher, to the rest of the units who are being sent to provide you whatever assistance that you might need. Again, these are some basic concepts that I just want the group to be familiar with. Regarding, he spoke a little bit of an active shooter, and I'm going to kind of overlap that with what's called a barricaded gunman, which is kind of the second progression of an active shooter. An active shooter incident is something that he mentioned is quick and over with. However, at times, that gunman or gun person ends up in the building with or without hostages, where we need to contact our QRT to respond to the incident. QRT stands for Quick Response Team, and the QRT team in York County specifically is consisting of, they're part-time. They're all full-time officers, but that is something that's a special assignment. They practice once or twice a month. They go about 15 call-outs a year. But I'm bringing this up because it takes them longer to respond to an incident. An entire response from the QRT team to wherever in the county we're going is about 2 hours. Now, some people then say, well, why don't we call the state police? Because they have 2 teams for the state. That's correct. Even though we're centrally located, response time from a PSP QRT team is about 4 hours. So you're most likely dealing with us regardless. Now, again, that being said, depending on the incident, especially for an active shooter, we're not going to stage outside the building. Most likely, the response is going to be 4 on-duty officers with shields coming in together. That'll be the first team that responds inside. And this sounds terrible, but the fact of it is, once they respond in, their objective is to go to the sound of the gunshots, to put an end to whatever damage is being created at that point in time. And the terrible part is that if they encounter wounded people, they're going to pass right over them. The priority is to end what's going on before treatment of the victims. George mentioned to walk toward the police, and that's correct. George mentioned to listen to the police commands, that's correct. However, I'd like to add to that that the police are not 100% sure if you are a good guy or the bad guy. So make sure your hands are visible. You are going to be treated as if you might be a suspect, even if there are still shots going on elsewhere within the building. So be prepared to be patted down, and you'll be debriefed, and we'll get all the intel from you outside in a safe area. Just something that I always like to express ahead of time before we get to that thing. He then talked about civil disobedience, and I'm sure the group's familiar, but we did have a number of protests down here, and I was relatively proud of what we had. Everyone's got a First Amendment right to speak their minds, and that's fantastic, and they got permits and everything. We only had a couple of mostly minor criminal mischief incidents. There were people who were contacting me directly and contacting the department, business owners saying, hey, what should I do? What should I do? And that's good. I encourage that. Please contact us ahead of time. We have people specifically and exclusively assigned to get intel on the groups coming in. He mentioned the anarchists. There is a very large national group that did come down here on the Tuesday night. We identified several of them in the area. There was at least 15. We were anticipating more of an issue than we had. But I can tell you that it was very nice to see that we had one subject cause a problem at the police station. The crowd we had, fortunately, chased that man away. We did not have to get involved. There were some comments about why weren't the police out on the street with all these things. I can tell you this, we were more than ready, but the decision was made, and I completely agree with it, that showing any type of a crowd that's having a protest, 40 or 50 or 80 or 90 actually, we had police officers in riot gear If that's not necessary, we're not going to do that. That's going to contribute to the problem. So that decision, we never crossed that line. We didn't have to get there. We were ready to do so. We didn't have to do that. That's the answer to that question that I've been asked repeatedly since these things went down. And again, the people that get the intel, some things we can distribute, some things we cannot. Give us some time, because once we're getting ready for this stuff, it's a little bit of a different issue. But when you have those questions, get them to us as early as can, and we'll get you everything we can as we're prepping for the incident. Those are kind of the things I wanted to bring forward today. George, you did a great presentation. I completely agree with everything you said to the group. And I really welcome any questions we have from the group about things I can address specifically in our neighborhood. We're still having people with permits that are still having events. I was at one on Monday night. It was perfectly peaceful, and it was a good event. They went for a walk through the neighborhood. They didn't block intersections. They actually were guiding traffic through. That's to be encouraged. That's a good thing. That's a positive thing. And so if you see these things continuing, it's absolutely okay at this point. We're monitoring them. It's in their right, and they're being run the correct way. I'm not going to go out and tell you that this is over. There will be no more violence or issues, because I can't promise you that. But I can tell you that for the things we're seeing going on right now, they're positive, and they're being run very well. So thank you for the opportunity to come on in, and I really welcome questions about the things I just brought up to you.
Yes, and thank you, Sergeant Kaler. We appreciate you coming on, offering your firsthand advice to us and guidance. And I want to say and just echo your comments that I am very proud of York City and how we have handled and conducted ourselves with very peaceful, constructive demonstrations for the better good of the community. And so we do have some questions that have come in through Q&A. I just want to encourage anyone else who is on the call, if you have a question that you'd like to ask for either of our presenters, please enter them in Q&A. And I'm just going to start with a few of them here. So I think this would be more for you, Sergeant Kaler, because you were previously in your career a downtown officer. And the question is, would you have any advice for restaurant owners, retailers, about the layout of their store and how to position employees so that they can best handle or mitigate conflict situations? For example, one of the things that was talked about is if a customer is unwilling to wear a mask coming into the store, with signs posted that they must wear protective covering, and maybe becomes hostile. How do you handle that?
Yeah, I was downtown. I missed you by about 2 years. My apologies. But I'd be more than happy that if Officer Reiner, the downtown officer now, can't, then I would do it myself. Come out to those businesses and take a look. The concepts we usually like to stick with are straight lines. And I know that doesn't go well with design in a business a lot of times, but lines of sight, and as George referred to, exits that are notable and places where you can disappear if need be. I've done a number of these for a bunch of businesses when I was the downtown guy. Like I said, I'd be happy to do them individually for businesses in the future. That's not a problem. Like I said, the basic concepts are exits, lines of sight, and cameras if you have them.
Great, thank you. And we will share that with our merchants. We have a merchant e-newsletter, and we will share with them that that offer is available if they'd like to have a place of business assessment with you or downtown officer. Yes, and we do know the downtown officer very well. He's been fantastic to work with.
Thank you.
Elaine, if I could just add to that, customers are not going to be aware that there's an exit, for example, out through the kitchen area, so that, you know, your employees are going to be instrumental in directing them to the nearest exits. Typically, creatures of habits, they're going to go out the same door they came in and be unaware that there's an exit much closer to them, 5 feet away, as opposed to walking all the way from the front. So again, your employees, they're going to look for them for some guidance as well, especially if there's an armed intruder event. You want to get them out of harm's way as quickly as possible. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I did one of these presentations for the Strand Capital, and herding cats was the term we use. If things are going to go crazy, the people are going to go back to where they came from because it's what they're familiar with. And even though there's exit signs posted, with the Strand Capital, we discussed the ushers being a valuable asset to that, to help people go to the directions. But yeah, exactly the same concept. And I totally agree with that.
And George, this next question is for you. And I know you talked about this in some degree with some of the guidelines that you had, like practical advice. What is your best advice for dealing with a customer or patron who appears to be struggling with issues related to mental illness? Are the de-escalation tactics the same? And are there resources available that business owners can find online or within community partners to help?
Yeah, there's a number of resources certainly, but one thing to keep in mind is in dealing with someone with mental issues, the tone of the voice, yelling and screaming and lights and that sort of thing may set them off much more so than person not experiencing those kinds of issues. You have to be extremely compassionate and sympathetic and calm as much as you can in dealing with individuals like that. And yeah, some of the resources, and I don't have them off the top of my head, but certainly, and maybe Sergeant Kaler may be able to suggest some in addition. But there's a number of resources out there that may be available for you. I am not the one to kind of tell you what those are, unfortunately.
We had, George, maybe you can help me with this. We have officers trained in I don't remember the acronym, but and Officer Reiner's one of those people. It's special training for police to deal with mentally ill. And we've had groups do presentations on that as well. And if that's something we want to look for down the road, Elaine, you and I could talk about that. We could see if we can work something out. We can incorporate that into one of these at some point. That wouldn't be an issue.
That would be fantastic. Maybe
Yeah.
as a continuation of this conversation later in the year, we can incorporate that into a business series or some other resource or webinar for merchants. That would be great. And last question before we wrap up, we're very close to the half hour. You mentioned about having recording devices or safety or cameras, closed circuit television. Do you recommend that people record situations with their cell phones if it's safe to do that? So is there any value in that, Sergeant Kaler?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't care what type of the incident it is. Yes, if it can be safely done. Now, there's a group I'm going to do a presentation for here coming up, and the topic is what to do when stopped by the police. And people have been asking and people have been advised to videotape that with their cell phones. And I agree with that because we already have body cameras, so why not? But the specific example I'm talking about is if you don't have your phone out and the police are stopping you for something, I don't want it to look negative if you're pulling something out of your pocket. So do I agree with using your cell phone to videotape things? Absolutely. Please do it in a safe way, though. That's all I ask. That's a monstrous concept. I don't want someone to get hurt for trying to videotape something. That's not worth the risk.
Right. Not the goal, for sure.
Also, Elaine, for closed circuit TV cameras, make sure that they're well maintained, good resolution. Recording should be kept for at least 30 days, we recommend from a security industry perspective. I know I see a number of police officers talk about they pulling the CCTV videos and it just, you can't even make out whether the person's a male or female or, you know, it's just the resolution is so poor. So now's the time to make sure that your closed circuit TV cameras are working properly. The cobwebs are clean and you know, there's positioned in the right areas.
Can I add to that through the Crime Watch app that we have? We ask that people register their cameras so that we know where they are without having to keep constantly asking and asking and asking. It'll save you time, and we totally understand if you only want us to use exterior cameras. I get that as well, but it helps us do our job. It's the Crime Watch app, York City Police underneath it.
Thank you. And we'll add that in our merchant e-newsletter as well, the Crime Watch app, the business audit. And so as we close out the time, I just want to be respectful of everyone's schedule and say thank you to both of our presenters for the expert advice, the guidance, and for being a resource to us beyond this workshop here this morning. And please save the date, everyone, for our next business series presented by PNC. It's July 15th. You can go to downtownyorkpa.com, click on the business series under the merchant resources, and you'll find all of the dates for the rest of the year. And if you'd like to rewatch this or share this with someone in your network, a recording of this webinar will be available on the downtownyorkpa.com website this afternoon. So thank you again to everyone for joining us, to our presenters, George, Richard Kaler. We appreciate you. Everyone have a great day and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you very much.
All.
Take care.